Thanks everybody for coming out. I'm going to read and talk to you a little bit about writing this book, and then hopefully leave lots of time afterwards to talk. I'm going to show you pictures today. One of the big satisfactions of publishing this book and making it distinct from other books I have published is that my publisher let me put pictures in the book, and that was partly driven by my desire to acknowledge the artists who were crucially inspirational in me writing the book. But once they were in the book, a really strange kind of thing started to happen where I had let some of the artists read early drafts of the novel, and pieces of art were actually coming to life in the city that originated in the book. So pictures of those artworks also appear in the novel. So there was a kind of an interesting two-way flow, and I've just been made aware that the street artist character that I fabricated, or I thought I fabricated for this novel, whose name is Rabbit, there is a documentary filmmaker working right now, and I have nothing to do with this. I stress this is not a clever marketing campaign. But there's a documentary film. I wish it were actually. I wish I thought that way. But there's a documentary film in progress called Finding Rabbit, in part because there's a rabbit tag that has been appearing all over Vancouver, and there's some discussion in the street art community about whether I made up Rabbit or not, or whether he in fact was real all along. It's all far too complicated for me. I just write books. But let me start off the top then by saying the story in summary. This is a book about a hostage crisis. In a television studio, a guy storms the studio and takes a bunch of kids hostage who are participating in a television show called Kitty Fame, which is like an idol show for the 3 to 7-year-old set. And he makes no particular demands, which is very mysterious and the source of added tension, because nobody knows what he wants, except that he wants to talk to this journalist named Tom Pegg, who is sort of a disgraced former investigative journalist now living in Los Angeles, dissolute and depressed, working for a tabloid. The other two characters that we'll meet are a loved local celebrity and athlete named Eve Latour, and a street artist, Rabbit, who I mentioned a minute ago, who she meets. And at the time the hostage crisis breaks out, Rabbit has been working and is just about completed this massive city-scale street art installation involving installations at the tops of hundreds of buildings through the city. And this is nobody's quite sure what he's doing or what's going to happen when he turns the thing on. So let's look at some art and just talk about it, because I think it's fun. I really love this work. And I will go backstream only one more time to comment on something that Werner Herzog has said many, many times in different interviews, to the effect, we need to find adequate images for our civilization or we'll die out like dinosaurs. This is sort of enigmatic thing that he returns to. He said the first time I encountered it was in the movie Werner Herzog Eats His Shoe, which is a kind of a joke documentary done by Les Blanc, and you're probably aware of it. But during that, which Alice Waters at Chez Panisse cooked up a desert boot for him, and he ate it, and he commented midway through that something to the effect, if we switch on television, it's just ridiculous and it's destructive, it kills us. And the talk shows kill us, they kill our language. I'll skip forward a bit. So give us adequate images. I think civilization is doomed. We're going to die out like dinosaurs if we don't develop adequate images. So this is a really strident message that he's repeated and declined to explain, and I can't either. I'm not 100% sure exactly what he means, except to say that if in the late 70s Herzog made that observation, sort of confronting the din of media as he perceived it at that time, it's difficult to imagine how much more that sentiment would apply today when the speed and pace and volume of our intake of images is just exponentially greater. So and without understanding fully what he means by an adequate image, and without necessarily suggesting that street art is this adequate image, which puts a lot of weight on the shoulders of these artists, I would say that I could easily imagine a street artist being inspired by this statement. So that was the first moment that Rabbit started to come to life, when I imagined him having Werner Herzog in the back of his head, echoing away there and sort of driving him onwards to do his work. One of the artists that was most influential is a guy named Byron Cameraman, and this is a fantastic installation he put up, I think it was 2007, during the Vannies Culture Crawl. And he was working with a sound artist named Emma, and what they did is using like 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, which they get an image in Photoshop and they panel it out and print these things, and then they wheat paste them onto surfaces. And in this case, they've duplicated this familiar cheap alarm clock. What you can't see is that buried in the weeds all through the blackberry cane is little Ziploc bags with dollar store alarm clocks in them. And at 9 o'clock in the evening on the culture crawl. This is Union Street right here. This is in Strathcona. You might recognize it. And that's a railway transformer, of course. At 9 o'clock in the evening, it's really dark, and people are wandering up and down Union Street going from studio to studio like they do during the crawl. And then this orange thing appears in the blackness off the street, about 20 yards off the street, just poof, and it starts to ring. And it rings for a good long time. And people on the crawl who are, there's hundreds of people walking up, everyone just froze. And I knew it was happening, so I was kind of hiding, watching. And it was a fantastic effect. I think the question probably, people were laughing and smiling and smiling. It's really notable, crowds of people smiling, like, look at that thing, it's so cool, and I don't even really get it. It's 9 o'clock, true, but that's so weird. So, and I think that effect, that the way that the art here, without making any comment on Byron and Emma's actual motives or how they would describe this thing, I was on hand to observe the way that object intersected with the people who saw it. And I can say that intersection was this spontaneous, delightfully mysterious moment, and those are rare. Here's another one, cameraman's masterpiece. I won't dwell on it. It sort of says everything that has to be said. It just appeared in Blood Alley one Saturday morning, and again, a huge crowd formed, and people were taking pictures of it and having their pictures. This is obviously Louis Vuitton luggage, a dumpster made up to look like a piece of Louis Vuitton luggage. And I don't know, why does Byron cameraman not have a show at the VAG with like 100 of these dumpsters? Tell me that, with like a Facebook dumpster and a Target dumpster. It's such a good idea, but anyway. This is an interesting one, kind of an inspirational one in a particular way. This is technically not street art, I guess you could say, because it's hidden. It's hidden in the basement of an art space on Hastings Street called the Red Gate. And if you get to know Jim Carrico, who runs that space, you could probably go down and look at it, but otherwise it's sort of a secret. And it's done by a very, very well-known character on the downtown east side, an artist named Ken Foster, who is a street artist in the sense that he makes art and sells it on the street. He doesn't actually mount it, he's trying to make money with it. And he long ago did this crazy dragon, and the dragon is buried on Hastings Street, and you can go have an appointment with the dragon and stare at this thing, and it's not clear why he painted it there or what he was ever hoping to get out of it, but it's become this kind of iconic hidden thing at the heart of the downtown east side art scene. And it was influential on me. In fact, in the novel I explore the idea of a hidden work of art and how it can carry such inspirational power. My sense of it being that where the artist's motive can't be understood, when it just defies any explanation why an artist would take the time, the thing turns into a very special kind of gift. There's no other reason. Ken Foster is, I can assure you, not getting rich or famous off of this mural, and yet it has this strange kind of resonant power for the people who know it, and that seems like so rare and special. I'm going to leave this one up as I do a couple of readings. This is another really standout work in my view. It's massive, by the way. That's like 10 or 15 feet high. And as you can see, it's made of big sheets of paper, and it's done by an artist named Germ9, who is not in Vancouver anymore. Sadly, he's gone to do his work in Peterborough now. But what this is layers of text. On the top is this rain from dark clouds, raining down of words, which speaks very much to Germ9's practice, which is a kind of gushing forth of thoughts and observations. And he mostly works with banners, small banners, which he just puts up. He put up thousands of these banners. If you ever saw a banner on a bus stop that said "Capital Isn't," that would be Germ9, or "Vandal Isn't." Anyway, this is those cascading letters that are falling down and taking their place in the forms of a line of a very painful rap. He's an MC too, and the verse is about the abuse that he suffered when he was incarcerated as a teenager, and that verse falls into place over the top of pages from his unpublished autobiography in progress, an equally tragic document in some ways, but triumphant too. And I just endlessly enjoy the way that Germ takes the city and makes a statement out of its walls. It's sort of therapy, but it's kind of beautiful therapy. So let's read a bit about Rabbit. I'm actually going to read a particular passage where Rabbit has a strange past. He emerges in this city and starts building this strange project, and He has come, all that anybody knows about him is that he sort of heaved up out of the West one day and arrived in this city, and people don't know his background. When he meets Eve, they form a connection. The city is reeling with this terrifying event, this hostage crisis, and a bond forms between them, perhaps in part as a result of the tensions in the air around them. And so he tells her, he comes clean with her at one point and tells her about his background in Oregon. He actually worked in technology. And here is a story about Rabbit's background, what he was before he was an artist, and how he became to be so inspired by Herzog. So now Eve alone knew what happened to Rabbit in Oregon. It didn't worry her to be in that position. It galvanized her interest in him. Eve now had different mental pictures to work with. Rabbit in a clean laboratory, Rabbit in a conference room with team members, Rabbit waking up uncomfortably to how his ideas were actually going to be used. Nobody was dying as a result of my work. I realized that, Rabbit told Eve. There were jobs in Raytheon and Intel where I could have worked on control systems for cluster bombs and joint standoff weapons. I was working on a phone. I was helping design the newest, latest, hottest version of a device most people use to order pizza, to text their friends. But what a phone. What an idea. From a technical standpoint, it had been fun to work on. Of course, it was also an internet device and a video camera and a GPS and a music player. And yes, the prototype was also designed with an integrated biometric fingerprint and retina scanner, so the device was useless if it was stolen. And it could also log user medical information like blood pressure, blood type, pulse rates, etc. But the fact that it could do all those things was secondary to the phone's chief innovation, which was a function that would ultimately be invisible to its users. And what was that? Eve asked. It listened to you, Rabbit said. Eve thought about that one for a second or two. Don't all phones listen to you? Well, not actively, Rabbit said. They just transmit. And even so, they don't generally transmit unless you're on a call. Eve was trying to work this through. The phone was designed to eavesdrop? User intelligence, they called it, or sometimes behavioral fingerprinting. The phone was designed to sample the life of its user. Ambient noises, television shows on in the background, music choices. The system then synced that data up with all other information collected, downloads, GPS logs, voice traffic, medical data, and built a user profile that allowed the device to assemble phone books or web links to push ads and suggestions at you through the browser, even dial 911 and transmit medical data in the case of an emergency. Which was, maybe a little more fun than some people would want, Rabbit said, but what was a lot stranger, what really got into Rabbit's head and wouldn't come out, was the client-side request late in the project for silent dial-out functions. Silent what? Eve asked. Dial out. These capabilities enabled the phone to upload user profile data to preset third-party locations, as in without people knowing, Eve said. Rabbit shrugged. Conceivably without them knowing, yes, the phone could have been designed to do that. He personally never got that far with it. Because you realized all that would be completely illegal, Eve asked. Well, it wasn't illegal to test it, Rabbit told her. We were designing a prototype, a feasibility study. MADAM, the client called it, Massively Distributable Data Acquisitions Module. Rabbit didn't remember thinking once about what the device might represent if half the country or half the world owned one until that late client request that upload features be developed. And if there was any chance Rabbit was going to get his head around that part, there was much less of a chance the following morning when a whole raft of new non-disclosure agreements were shipped over by the client's lawyer to be signed immediately and returned. Rabbit signed, but why the paranoia? What exactly had they been working on? Maybe we really were just tossing around ideas for a super smart phone, Rabbit said, but that morning I realized I didn't know. Maybe I was developing the most sophisticated low-maintenance wiretap the world had ever seen. Selling people stuff and surveillance have a big overlap, if you see my point here. I do, and I'm kind of scared to ask the next part, Eve said. Rabbit nodded. He knew where all this led if you thought about it. Who was the client? Eve asked. Short answer, Rabbit said, nobody I worked with had any idea. We used a code name in-house, Blue 52. Blue 52, Eve said. And who did you think that might be? Rabbit looked at Eve steadily. I didn't know. I would have been guessing. Looking at those agreements that morning, it suddenly occurred to me I didn't want to start guessing. I thought, maybe there is no client. The phone was our only project. Maybe Blue 52 was my employer. You understand? Eve thought she did. She had different mental pictures for Rabbit now. Rabbit alone in the evening, something troubling him, making him afraid. The idea that he might have been in place on a game board, playing a role quite different than the one he'd imagined. The idea that all along he'd been playing as a mole. And here came the big epiphany, Rabbit said. It was a real if-then situation. What's that mean? If A, then B, meaning I understood the moment to be one of choosing. He went to a rep house called the Starlight Theatre that same evening. He didn't even know what was playing, but he'd been thinking about his parents, who'd been gone almost 2 years at that point, and he suddenly needed the anonymity of darkness. Turned out, it was an Errol Morris film, Gates of Heaven, with a short first, Werner Herzog Eats His Shoe. Rabbit was preoccupied, hardly paying attention, his mind running back and forth between childhood memories and the things he'd just learned at work. He had a sense of being involved in something sophisticated, but also crude and primitive, something that took the world backwards. Then Werner Herzog spoke off the screen, across 30 years, to Rabbit alone. I'll never forget the words, he said to Eve. Herzog said, if you switch on television, it's just ridiculous and it's destructive. It kills us. And talk shows will kill us. They kill our language. So we have to declare holy war against what we see every single day on television. Holy war. Blue 52. Fewer than a dozen other people in the theater. Rabbit frozen with a handful of popcorn halfway to his mouth. There was something going on here, some other business, vast and spreading, and Rabbit felt certain, highly toxic. Herzog said, give us adequate images. We lack adequate images. Our civilization doesn't have adequate images, and I think a civilization is doomed, or it's going to die out like dinosaurs if it doesn't develop an adequate language or adequate images. I see it as a very dramatic situation. So what did you do? Eve asked. Well, I thought of my parents, he said. I focused on that, and then I stopped showing up for work. It was the craziest conviction. It was like I was at the very brink of doing something terrible, and I just had to bow out. Weren't people upset? Oh yeah, they were, Rabbit said, but I never returned any of the calls. A couple weeks later, I got a big severance check. I think they were worried. So nobody came after you? No, Rabbit said, although I went and lived on a beach for about 4 months. Anybody coming after me would have concluded I'd wigged out, probably because I had wigged out. Rabbit told Eve he drove out to the dunes for the first time that night. He saw the film about Herzog. It was June. He lay down under a bank of sand, crested over with long, soft grass that he could pull over himself like a blanket. He lay there, hidden from the world. He slept and dreamed of high mountain fields, open views, places that reminded him of home but were not quite what he remembered from home. He woke when the moon came up, a radiant disk, Rabbit lying there in the sand under the grass, washed in silver light, stars exploding in their infinite patterns above. He was thinking again of his parents. If then, well, Rabbit thought, if I've been doing something I didn't realize all along, if I've been contributing to some project, the authors and objectives of which I don't even know, then either I'm helpless and I might as well go back to work, or it's time to prove that I can choose, that I can act, that I can create something of my own. So I'll stop there with Rabbit. So I sort of feel like it's incumbent on me to talk about both sides of the book. That was Rabbit and Eve in their preoccupation with his artwork and their relationship in a way represent in a very definitive way, represent the hopeful side of the book and the degree to which in a time of darkness and concern there are still sources of light. And that corresponds in some sense to my engagement with street art generally in our time. There is a way in which the act of the street artist is a hopeful gesture. And it has on more than one occasion led me to think, you know, as long as those guys, and actually they're certainly not all guys, but they were mostly guys in my exposure, as long as these people are out there doing this thing that I can't explain and putting up these images and creating them compulsively in their studios and apartments, and we're not done yet, you know? There's hope for us yet, despite the way the world seems poised and it's kind of fragile at the moment, and there's great uncertainty in the air. I don't think any of us turn on the news each morning without thinking, well, you know, it's like it could be anything. There could be another war happening right now. The Dow Jones could have fallen 10%. Why not? It fell 6% last week. You know, I mean, there's so much feasibility of disaster right now that it's difficult to surprise us. And in that atmosphere of doubt and sort of fragility, street art holds up its little flame. But on the other side of that, in my book, there are troubles as well. Of course, this hostage crisis is a source of great anxiety to the city, and while it stews more or less in silence, crowds gather in the plaza outside the theater, and there's great tension. There's a whole frightening set of possibilities that people are having a hard time calculating. So let's read a bit about that, I guess. Tom Pegg is the disgraced former investigative journalist I referred to earlier. He's been busted in a scandal involving made-up sources. And he's now working for a sort of a lad magazine in Los Angeles, the equivalent of Loaded or FMH, I think is one of them. And he's interviewing celebrities and living a rather dissolute lifestyle and not at all happy with himself. And out of the blue, he's contacted by these shadowy federal authorities who tell him that their hostage taker wants to speak to him. And this is a source of huge surprise to everybody who can't explain why this hostage taker would want to talk to that guy. And Pegg himself is not at all pleased at the honor. He doesn't want to go at all. So in a terrible state, having been drinking far too much, he finds himself on an airplane flying across the country to the city where this hostage crisis has occurred. Pegg jogged awake in the widest airline seat in which he'd ever had the pleasure to pass out. Not a government plane at all in the end, while those had definitely been federals of one stripe or another sent along to escort him, and whose opaque scheming seemed to be driving this whole adventure. It was his own publisher who provided the transportation, the owner of the magazine. Pegg was stunned. He'd only met the man once, and then briefly, and he didn't recall much of the conversation, having had it towards the blurry tail end of whatever evening it had been. But he couldn't previously have appreciated how much of a plaything, an ornament, a trinket the magazine was to this man, who had clearly made his money at altogether more serious gaming tables. Pegg's last tether to solvency, his job, and his editor Spratley's goodwill to retain him in it, was an oligarch's toe bauble. He looked around, wiping crust from the corners of his eyes and mouth. He saw cream leather upholstery. He saw a long passageway connecting different cabins. He saw a bar up front, sleeping rooms to the rear. He thought, bulk arms sales or private security services? But he didn't have any further opportunity to speculate along these lines as a face came hovering in. Or, more accurately, a non-face. Pegg remembered that just before he had fallen asleep, he'd started to think that none of them really sported faces, these men and women sent along to shepherd him. They moved and shaped their features into various expressions, but not as faces did, which in Pegg's experience was a process that you could observe to operate just beyond the owner's control. You told a joke, a person laughed. You told a sad story, a person shed a tear. These faces moved only in response to what was carefully authored within. He was looking at the face now, the non-face. He was thinking, passed out. Yes, that was it. These were brutal hangover symptoms after 2 hours' sleep, the rapid calculation of how and who. Pegg said, and then began to cough, and cough again. The non-face said, you're awake then. Up, yes, Pegg answered, or rather, yes, up. We'll be on the tarmac in 40 minutes here. We have things to cover. Right, Pegg said. All right, cover. The non-face withdrew, leaving Pegg to his computations. If he'd passed out, surely he would have given them all the information they needed to have changed their minds about him by now. They would have phoned ahead and switched the teams to plan B or C or D or whatever it was they were down to by then, released the gas or whatever non-lethal method had been dreamt up most recently for snatching hostages from bad guys. Forget the gossip jockey. Pegg imagined someone important saying grimly to someone else important, tight-lipped, he's no use to us. He was unconscious minutes after takeoff when we were in the middle of his briefing. Pegg winced in shame and self-reproach, a finding of guilt by an inward-pointing judiciary he no longer trusted. He impulsively pressed his fingers along his rib line, tracking the snake of pressure within, his internal organs chatting amongst themselves on that favorite topic of the worried and ailing everywhere, their worries and ailments. He distracted himself from the disquieted murmur, as he always did, by listening to other voices, and there were plenty now babbling from within his cringing memory. He'd fled the restaurant. He'd been out on a date when this phone call came in. He'd fled the restaurant and chastity with his dignity and composure more or less intact. But then at the airport, in the long white foyer outside the ramp, he'd seen them, these federal non-faces, and his heartbeat had sped and thinned and gone fluttery. 5 white shirts at the end of the hall, touching their ears and talking into their lapels. He felt clandestine airways jump, crosshairs on his scalp. He felt branched out and connected to problems all around the world through them, through these agency types with pistols tucked into their armpits. He didn't like the feeling at all and had to fight the urge to turn and run. He had a real moment of calculation there, insane arithmetic. He could be outside the terminal in 15, 10 minutes. Find a taxi safely into his second vodka at 7 at Giggles around the corner from his apartment in 45 minutes, tops. He made his way to the men's instead, into a stall. Find his way through all of this. Gravol, he said. And he took a handful of those, but he also downed his remaining pocket bottles of vodka and binned the empties, and then the little safety flask of cognac too, and then the rest of his Gravol to keep him from ralphing it all up again. Aboard the aircraft, minutes later, he was just processing the environment for the first time, escorted to his seat, given some papers to look over. The plane surged, but nobody stopped talking. Nobody stopped this rolling business of tearing him out of his life. Someone said, "You're not entirely new to this, though, are you? Working the hot zone. You've worked a few hard stories in your day, haven't you, Tom Pegg?" That's right, Pegg answered. "A few really big ones." And then he realized he wasn't talking. He was only thinking and staring. He was hearing takeoff noises, his head bending over onto someone's shoulder. "Well, all right then, you good? Can we get going here?" When they came back into Pegg's cabin and started taking their seats again, Pegg registered that the speaker was one who hadn't been in the room before, slightly different in frame and focus than the others. He was a little more boxy around the middle, nicer suit, better shoes, quite nice shoes, in fact. Agency man, Pegg thought, waking hard, visions shaky, organs a-chatter. "Brother," the man said, "you look awful." Yeah, the Gravol kicked in hard. The man laughed pleasantly enough. "My goodness, did it? I'd say you were allergic." Which made them all laugh, a short tapering convulsion like a group of actors doing a first read-through and encountering the word laugh in the script. "Bruce," the man said, hand extended, "Bruce Hayden." Pegg was decent with accents, but Hayden's went right by him. Distantly Caribbean, American, Southern, trace of Asia and a good school, maybe a slice of English on his mother's side, a global hybrid in fancy clothes. Hayden also wore an unusual pin in his left lapel, a sterling silver frog with gemstone eyes. Pegg wondered if this whimsical detail was designed to put people at ease, in which case Hayden was suffering under a grave misapprehension, as for Pegg, nothing would at the moment. "Are you my handler?" Pegg asked him. "You could say that," Hayden answered, still smiling. "Where are you from?" "Oklahoma originally," Hayden said. "You?" "Boring story. Is coffee possible?" Someone produced coffee, which Pegg fussed with and then partly spilled and then sipped and burnt himself and dribbled on his shirt. Nobody spoke, so he did first. He said, "Well, I'm sure you can all imagine that I'm wondering very much what the hell is going on here." Hayden nodded and stopped smiling. He considered the matter briefly while tapping a folder on the low table between them with his index finger. Then he took a slow breath and he said, "I voted against getting you involved." Pegg nodded, eyebrows raised. There had been no vote, he was quite sure, but he didn't mind Hayden saying it so casually because that meant Pegg had at least one piece of vital information about the man opposite. He lied with ease and practice. He lied like a professional. "But it seems an interview with you is the only thing that we can give the hostage taker," Hayden went on, "because it's the only thing that he will tell us that he wants." "He being who exactly?" Pegg asked. It was a bit unclear. Although this didn't seem to concern Hayden overly, they had a dark theater, people coming out reporting all kinds of things. "So they're letting people go," Pegg said. "That's good, isn't it?" "Not always," Hayden said. "Lunatics came loaded with lunatic logic," he said, "and since this one probably wouldn't have bothered getting kitted out for killing, if he wasn't planning on doing any, the pattern of releases only suggests that he was whittling things down to some favorite pattern." "His favorite number," Pegg said. "His favorite hour," Hayden said, "his favorite astrological pattern or numerological sequence. Who knew what data stream he might be drawing on? They had people working on the pattern, how many were released and when. It might suggest something, but Hayden wasn't holding his breath. The key detail was that they had someone in there, someone who had discharged his weapon and killed at least one person, someone who now held 40-odd people hostage and wanted to speak to Tom Pegg. "So, some logistical things you'll need to know." This was another voice, just behind Tom. He didn't look. "Hang on," Pegg said. He was heating. Hayden was good. Move on through the flattery, don't linger. But the coffee was working, and Pegg had biological malfunction on his side, making him brave. He was deliciously hungover on almost no sleep, his organs alight with unknown acids, and the plane had just nosed down now to begin its descent too, that long ramp down to the ground to whatever was waiting there. As his ears popped, he let himself go. "You realize what I do, right?" he said finally, "my regular day." Hayden was nodding, eyes closed. Yes, they knew. 2 hours access with a couple of publicists hovering. I sip a cup of tea near a pool, and then I bugger off and write something that flatters without fawning. Hayden's eyes popped open. "Is that what you do? Flatter? I thought you more like to fuck with them a little, on occasion even go for the jugular, take someone down." "However I do it," Pegg said. "The fact is my job is generally senior ranked. Among those things that the nutcase class hate most about us, and I mean, of course, what they crave wholly and then blame us for making them crave. Showbiz, you mean, Hayden said. Hollywood. The whole structure. Red carpets, swimming pools, sound stages, publicity, fake tits. He may not be like the other guys, Hayden said, who've done it before. He has to be like them in at least one way, Peg said. He thought of it, which is why they call it terrorism, folks. Religious or political or psychotic, it's just some color of hate. And I don't care if it's Aryan Nation or Army of Christ or Brotherhood Against the Infidels, because approximately everybody in the world has a reason to hate us. And by us, I mean you and me. And I assume by now you've checked online to see who's boasting about this one. Someone posting out of Idaho or Gaza, Afghanistan, or the Kootenays. The unintended effect of this run through the numbers was that they all laughed again, only this time it was a short, nervous laugh, there and gone. Hayden looked to his left and nodded. Someone spoke again from some intermediate distance over Peg's shoulder. He didn't turn. There was no point. Not terrorism, Mr. Peg. It's just not a word we're using. It's hostage-taking. Peg felt a slight pressure in his head, all that knowledge swirling and adding mass in a container of decidedly fixed dimensions. Hayden leaned in, elbows to his knees, chin to folded hands, bridged index fingers to his nose, frog lapel pin widening its gemstone eyes in the light. Hayden said, "You hate your work." "I don't exactly. I know it's complicated. You hate your subjects. Whether I do or not, we're 8-9 hours into a bad situation here, Mr. Peg. Are we wasting jet fuel? Nobody wants to force you. Nobody could force you." Peg let his eyes refocus on the unflappable oaky reggae tie. There was more. He knew he was about to get the last part of the pitch, and he wanted to hear it too, since he already knew what it was, and he hoped very much that it was true. "You end up being part of the solution," Hayden said. "I didn't see this at first, but there it is. You're part of bringing people out, kids without food or toilets, sitting in the dark. There's a lot of crying going on in there, we hear, a lot of fear, holding up very strong, but 9 hours. Try to imagine hour 48, hour 72. "But there won't be any hour 72, Peg said, will there? You don't help people because you have perfect information, do you? Sometimes you step in to help people because you think it's the right thing to do. We all remember this in theory, don't we? Doing things because they're the right thing, sometimes doing more than we should, all because of a conviction or a need." Peg and Hayden made a short bridge of their stairs, a checkpoint Charlie at which they met and made the trade. So the briefing proper began, as the pressure rose against their eardrums, as they hit a spot of turbulence and shuddered through. And the only surprise to Peg then was the kind of information Hayden chose to share from his various folders, handed to him by others and laid open flat on the table in front of him. First, the clothes. Yes, it seemed they'd gathered a lot of information about the perpetrator from the civilian clothes retrieved by one of the cars that had been set alight in the minutes before the whole thing began. A diversionary tactic was their best guess, but what was inside was what offered clues. Running shoes, jeans, khakis, college t-shirts, button-downs, hoodies, anoraks, a wool hat with a Green Bay Packers logo. No foreign brands, no foreign labels, and a short silence dropped as the air howled past outside. They were tunneling the freezing clouds towards a nightmare that could now be considered in this fresh light. A nightmare of us, dreaming of we, desperate to wake of ourselves. Next, theater layout. Seats, selection, and aisles, exits and service doors where people were sitting or thought to be sitting. And then the bomb. Explosives, trigger systems. They thought the man was carrying a single large charge, big enough to take down the building. The God charge, they called it. Peg swallowed coffee. His organs, he noted, were silent. He said, "I have this terrible feeling that you might possibly think I'm going to enter that studio, actually go into that theater." Peg had imagined himself in a tent somewhere, in a parking lot around the corner from the theater, on the phone, with someone like Hayden right there at his elbow, handing him his lines. He'd imagined all this taking place on a set. Now Peg slid his coffee mug away, as if he'd just tasted a dangerous flavor underlying the breakfast blend. He surveyed the non-faces around him. He spoke again, although now he could hear that his voice lacked conviction, that it revealed him to be aware of the trap. And if that's the case, well, then you'd all be mad, wouldn't you? But they were all leaving the cabin now, gathering up their papers and filing out, taking their seats up front. Peg could hear the buckles snapping and the tray tables being stowed. He registered the placeless ding of the overhead light. Fasten your seatbelts, we're about to land. Although nobody came back to remind him or check. And he didn't do it either. He just leaned over to the window, let his face slide in close, bare dawn over the rising city, the shape of it gradually making itself clear in the rosy murk.